Is Zelensky just like Churchill? Is Putin just like Mr. H from World War II German socialist fame? Is this just like the eve of World War II, where the US could have stopped the war if they'd only intervened early? The US media is peopled by morons. They like to reduce the truly complicated down to literally an elemental nature. Kind of like saying hydrogen and methane are pretty much the same thing since methane contains hydrogen. The history of media usage of Mr. H and Churchill might shed a little bit of light on that, talking about what's happened in the past. Essentially, our media seen Hitler everywhere. Have you heard of the Hitler on the Nile? Gamal Abdul Nasser of Egypt, according to the Washington Post and Time, was the very embodiment of Adolf from Germany. How about tropical Hitler, quote unquote? That's Fidel Castro. This came from the Washington Post and Time. African Hitler, New York Times and Time Magazine. This was Idi Amin. Interesting though, this is probably one of the few instances where the Hitler comparison is probably the closest to any of these other historical figures they're going to be bringing up. What about the Hitler of the desert? Wall Street Journal and Newsweek told us that was Muammar Gaddafi. How about a modern Hitler, according to the Los Angeles Times, a Los Angeles Times of long ago? Modern Hitler was Manuel Noriega. Know who that is? He was a dictator of Panama for a while that we invaded in order to stop his drug cartel. Hitler indeed, huh? And then rounding out a list of people that are more likely to be in your memory, Saddam Hussein. He was just like Hitler. Slobodan Milosevic was just like Hitler. And believe it or not, so was Osama bin Laden. I'm going to try to come up with a catchy graphic for that, but boy, the AI was just puking on that one. So, what about the Churchill comparison? Well, do you know that Harry S. Truman, just like Churchill? Dwight D. Eisenhower was also just like Churchill. John F. Kennedy, exactly like Churchill. Martin Luther King Jr. was Churchill himself. Ronald Reagan was Churchill. Margaret Thatcher, according to Newsweek, called her Churchill in skirts. Lech Walesa of Solidarity fame in Poland was just like Churchill. Did I slip and say Hitler somewhere in there? That meant to all be Churchill. I'm sorry if I did. George W. Bush was compared to Churchill. And more for our British cousins, Tony Blair was compared to Churchill. And rounding out our list, Churchill himself reincarnated Joe freaking Biden. Yes. Um, and this came out of, now mind you, the media has been disintegrating more, or these names would have had more weight in the past. Those folks mentioning Mr. Biden in church, walking in Churchill's steps, that was from the Atlantic and Politico. Yeah, and even very briefly, Benjamin Netanyahu got the nod, being Churchill reincarnated. So a lot of these are incredibly silly. If you've been around long enough, you've heard all of them. If you haven't, some of them might be new to you. But the point being is media gets it so wrong so often that the idea that after all these failed attempts to compare real historical people who have made incredible impacts on the world, both negative and positive, that they have the ability to nail it this time, finally. The media that at one time could actually be considered intellectual could never get it right. For decade after decade, the morons that now make up modern mainstream media have now nailed it. We now really have Churchill in charge of Ukraine, and we have Mr. H running Russia. You can take that to the bank. Sarcasm intended. What about a bonus? Throw a bonus in there. Charles de Gaulle. Got any guesses? Ahmad Chalabi was Charles de Gaulle. Now, a lot of you are going to be going, Ahmad Chalabi was going to be the government of Iraq once went in there and took it over and put him into place. Formed the government in exile, and everyone was touting him as a great, wonderful thing. And once everything happened, they discovered that, well, gee, nobody really knew who he was in Iraq, and no one was interested in being in charge. And so all the millions that were shifted his way via probably USAID NGOs disappeared with him, and he went off someplace to live in retirement. So, Putin, what is he? Now, obviously, because of the dripping sarcasm I think's been coming through, you'd say, well, I'm probably not saying he's Adolf walking in the flesh. So who is he? Well, clearly, Putin is a nationalist. That's a given. Um, there are some tinges of ethno-nationalism there, but these are pretty modest in scope if you look at other ethno-nationalist states in history. Now, Russia proper has many ethnic minorities. Some of them have been there hundreds of years. For the most part, yeah, they're kind of second class citizens. However, they toe the line and they listen to the state. You can rise through the ranks. So they are generally not persecuted unless they defy the central government. So if we're kind of looking at this whole idea of this being ethnic, how do the Russians view Ukrainians? Well, it's not that they look at them as somehow inferior beings. They're not looking at them as a group of people that need to be cleansed from the earth in order for their government, whatever the actual Russian philosophy of government is. They're not looking to genocide the Ukrainian people, as some of the more shrill globalists cry. Russian propaganda essentially says that Ukrainians are so similar to the Russians that they actually lack a distinct culture. So they're effectively Russians. Now, I'll be straight, I completely disagree with that propaganda. But that sure doesn't equate to German National Socialist propaganda of the 40s. Instead of saying that you are an inferior race that needs to be wiped out, it's like you are so similar you need to be assimilated. Not remotely the same thing at all. Now, people will note that the Russians have been accused of and most likely have committed vast amounts of war crimes. I expect this is true. I think it's widespread. The Russian military not only tends to be very undisciplined in the field, throughout its entire history, brutality is kind of built into its DNA, uh, all the way from the induction, the basic training, all the way through. They're a military that maintains order by essentially brutalizing people, and soldiers who are brutalized tend to treat people on the battle in a brutal way. Now, despite this, the Ukrainians are also accused by reputable international watch organizations of war crimes and atrocities, especially what was going on during the civil conflict in the Donbass region against the ethnic Russians. So, point being is Russia has no ethnic agenda akin to those being practiced during World War II Germany. Their current government really lacks the apparatus that the 1940s socialist Germany had. trying to say that somehow they're similar, there isn't a good comparison. Now, the best historical comparisons to the current Russian government would be that of the USSR, maybe Mussolini's Italy, and perhaps Peronist Argentina. Modern Russia echoes the USSR in its security focus and media control, though it lacks the Soviet Union's communist ideology and the idea of being totally economically in control of everything. In terms of 1940s Italy, Russia shares the personality leadership type thing and nationalism, but its system is less ideological rigid and more pragmatic than fascism ever was. And in terms of Perón's Argentina, it mirrors Russia's blend of charisma and nationalism and the managed economy, but little else. Well, how about World War II, specifically eve of World War II, compared to now? Because people are saying, gee, if we don't get involved, World War III is coming. Um, what people don't seem to realize is the United States actually gave very little aid, and I mean gave, in World War II. Most of this was quid pro quo agreements. The United States traded decrepit World War I battleships for 99-year leases on 8 British bases. The initial program, Help Out Europe, was called the Cash and Carry Program. It required European powers to travel to the United States, uh, have cash or gold, purchase them, and transport the equipment back themselves. Not much of a handout. And then later, they developed the Lend-Lease program and actually gave arms support on credit. And it's not like it was just this doesn't, it wasn't like something we did on paper as kind of a way around the laws. Uh, the Lend-Lease program was legit because the United Kingdom was paying on this up until 2006. So it's a real thing. Now, a lot of countries ended up reneging on their debt, but UK paid through. So it was considered a real thing. It wasn't just uh, a loophole to get around by giving out aid. So all these people who expect us to be just giving stuff to the Ukraine, that's actually not in line with historical perspective. Now, World War II was clearly a greater threat, for the most part, than anything that's going on in Ukraine. But we didn't just give away arms back then either, nor should we now. The failure to stand up to socialist Germany in the 30s, in terms of what we could be called the so called appeasement, is actually a deliberate historical distortion. Appeasement wasn't really a thing. It's what it got called later in order to cover up Britain's most disastrous policy ever. Well, maybe actually causing the Revolutionary War in America would be their most disastrous. They just be the most second most disastrous. Essentially, Britain chose to allow German expansion into German enclaves as a way to create a military power capable of standing up to Russia. So, assimilating Austria, uh, gathering up the Sudetenland, allowing them to reoccupy the Rhineland, all the things they did was not because they felt bad about what happened to the Germans in World War I, nor were they militarily frightened of them. In fact, just the opposite. The goal was to create a powerful military in Germany. Britain and France could have easily stopped Germany militarily at almost any point in the early 1930s. Britain allowed military expansion by the Germans, believing that a militarized Germany would balance out the continent against Russia. So the appeasement narrative doesn't work there. And the idea that negotiating with Putin is somehow appeasement is at least nonsensical, if at least, or at least nonsensical. and isn't really backed up by history saying that appeasement has always failed. In fact, I have a video out there called Appeasement Always Fails Until It Doesn't, or something really close. Now, looking at the Ukrainian situation prior to open war, a lot of people will, oh, well, look, the United States let Russia take Crimea away from Ukraine. Well, nobody let Russia take Crimea away from Ukraine. Crimea was jointly based by Ukraine and Russia. Russia already had the forces in place to take it all over due to post Soviet agreements. There were at least 25,000 troops on the ground at all times, may have been more in the last moments when they decided to take over. They had a naval base and an air base, which means they could supply it indefinitely as long as they controlled the Black Sea. So there was actually nobody capable of stopping the takeover. Worst case you could do is put sanctions on after it was all over, which is what they ended up doing. To a certain extent, the same goes for the Donbass turmoil primary to the war. It was a proxy campaign waged by Russian separatists supported by Russia. With no political or military agreements with the West, there was virtually nothing anyone could do to stop it from happening. Russia was fully willing to absorb all the sanctions we were willing to throw at it. We had no legitimate reason to be doing anything militarily there. Now, of course, immediately after Crimea was seized and while the whole Donbass thing was going on, the U.S. did intervene by creating joint CIA posts in Ukraine to share intelligence with them. This is one of the things that Russia looked at as us interfering in their backyard. One thing that's cited uh, by the essentially the Ukraine is just like World War II crowd is to cite Russia's global ambitions. Well, first, the Russians' initial invasion of Ukraine actually lacked the resources for total conquest and occupation of Ukraine. Now, it's possible the Russians just completely underestimated Ukraine, at least in terms of knocking their military over, but they didn't have enough forces for an occupation, at least not of the totality of Ukraine. They had enough for the areas that they considered critical. So the idea that they were going for a total takeover was questionable, and the idea that they were planning on expanding beyond Ukraine's borders was ludicrous. Second, Ukraine's ability to resist the Russians' action indicate that even if the Russians had global ambitions prior to the war, they certainly lacked the capability of carrying them out. Third, the worsening demographic conditions and ethnic strife on the periphery, and really Russia's incredibly poor economic model, point to lessening military capability over the future. So if they can't do it now, the likelihood that they're suddenly going to come up with this capability later isn't very probable. Finally, if Ukraine can thwart the entire Russian army, NATO, with 4 times the military personnel and an exponentially larger equipment capacity, is more than enough to stop Russia in its tracks. Now, this stuff hurts my brain because it ends up in this resulting nonsense where people are like, well, Russia can only be stopped in Ukraine by continuing the war. But Ukraine has slowed Russia down to a crawl. If the war stops, then somehow all of Russia's deficiencies disappear and suddenly they can roll over the top of NATO with no effort whatsoever. What is it? Is Ukraine actually stopping the Russians, or are they not stopping the Russians? Are they far more powerful than NATO, or are they not more powerful than NATO? Uh, Clearly, the idea that the only way this stops is to let the basically Ukraine be ground into nothing is silly. It's it's not supportable with the evidence around. Ukraine is strong enough to slow the Russians down to a crawl. If they can do it, NATO would be able to stop them in their tracks. Absolutely. Now, to sum up the last couple of points, were basically the idea that this is anything like World War II, or at least the eve of World War II. Um, the allies of socialist Germany attacked the United States during World War II. Japan hit Pearl Harbor. Russia has not attacked the United States. Maybe some cyber attacks, but we're doing the same thing in return. Probably initiated some as well. During World War II, socialist Germany could not reach the US. It was never going to be able to. It didn't have the naval power to project across the English Channel, so it wasn't coming here. Imperial Japan, at its very best, could only raid the Pacific side of the United States. Now, if Russia can't expand conventionally much further than it has, its potential capabilities getting worse as the future goes on. Why on earth do we think they're actually a threat to some form of global conquest? But the big problem, and this is the part that all the Ukraine can really beat Russia crowd is missing, the ones who think, oh, this is like right before World War II and we can stop it types, is that Germany and Japan were very limited in what they could do to us. However, if we push Russia hard enough, they have more nuclear weapons than any other people on the planet. What we've been doing up until this point has been playing a game of chicken with them, saying, okay, what point do we get them angry enough where they consider themselves to be in mortal danger? And the, nothing bad can happen crowd basically says, well, they've threatened to do this before and they haven't yet, so they just never will. Is that really worth playing this game over? I don't think it's worth playing chicken with a country that has the capability of taking out potentially all human life on Earth over another country, Ukraine specifically, that most Americans didn't even know existed 3 years ago. Most famously put up, most of them probably couldn't find it on a map. All right. So, in the comments below, what do you think? Zelensky, Churchill, is Putin just like Mr. Adolf Hitler? Is this the eve of World War II? Tell me what you think below. Did I make a good case on any of these, or do you see some big plot holes there that you can insert in the negative on? All right. So please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, check out my other titles. I get into a lot of different things. You'll find something you like, subscribe. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Well, thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.